The last performance. In the twilight of Kyoto's Gion district, where narrow streets wove between ancient wooden tea houses and lanterns glowed softly against the night, Satoko prepared for what she knew would be her final performance. She was one of the last true geishas, an artist who lived not only for beauty but for the discipline of perfecting it. Her story, like her craft, was one of quiet strength and survival. Satoko had been only a child when her family sent her to Enokia, the geisha house. It was the 1930s, a time when Japan teetered between its traditional past and an uncertain future. Her family was poor, and in their eyes, becoming a geisha was not just a profession but a path to honor. She trained for years as a maiko, an apprentice, mastering the shamisen, the art of dance, and the ritual of tea ceremonies. She learned to walk with grace, to speak with poise, and to hide every hint of her own emotions behind an enigmatic smile. By the time she earned her geisha title, she had become one of Gion's most sought-after performers. Men of power and influence paid handsomely to watch her dance, their eyes mesmerized by the flick of her fan or the way her sleeves seemed to float like petals in the wind. Satoko knew the power she held in those moments. It was not the men who controlled her, it was she who controlled the room, commanding silence with a single step. But the war came, and everything changed. In the 1940s, as Japan became engulfed in conflict, the glittering world of the geisha was no longer untouched. Many geisha houses closed, and women were sent to work in factories or serve as nurses. Satoko's Okia was one of the few that managed to survive, but the clientele dwindled. Nights in Gion grew quiet, the laughter and music replaced by the distant hum of planes and the whisper of ration cards. Satoko adapted. She performed for soldiers, her dances becoming a fleeting escape for men who knew they might not return from the front lines. She learned to smile through the tension, even as bombings drew closer. One night, after a performance in a makeshift hall, a young soldier approached her, his hands trembling as he offered her a folded paper crane. "This is for luck," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've given us so much beauty tonight. I wanted to give you something in return." Satoko took the crane and bowed deeply, her heart swelling with an emotion she could not name. She tucked the paper bird into her obi, and for years, it stayed with her, a reminder of a fleeting moment of humanity in a world unraveling. After the war, Japan began to rebuild, and so did Gion. The geisha world experienced a resurgence, but it was never the same. Western influences crept into every corner of life, and the once thriving art of the geisha began to fade. Satoko, now older but no less graceful, became a mentor to a new generation of maiko. She taught them not only the arts but also resilience, the ability to endure and adapt without losing oneself. By the 1970s, Satoko was one of the last practicing geishas in Kyoto. Tourists flooded Gion, eager to catch a glimpse of her as she glided down the streets in her silk kimono, her face painted white, her red lips a perfect bow. But they didn't see the weight she carried, the knowledge that her art, her life's work, was slipping away with each passing year. And so, on a crisp autumn evening, Satoko prepared for her final performance. She was 82 years old, her hands gnarled with age but still steady as she painted her face for the last time. The room was filled with a select few, patrons who had supported her for decades, apprentices who looked up to her with awe, and a handful of journalists documenting what they called the end of an era. When she stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. She began to dance, her movements slow and deliberate, each step a testament to a lifetime of dedication. The shamisen played softly in the background, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. As she performed, Satoko thought of the soldier's paper crane, now faded but still tucked away in a drawer. She thought of the war, the laughter of her youth, and the streets of Gion as they once were. And she thought of the future, of the young women she had trained, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, her art would survive through them. When the final note of the shamisen faded, Satoko bowed deeply, her hands trembling slightly as she straightened. The room erupted in applause, but she barely heard it. Her heart was too full, her mind too far away, caught in the memories of a life lived in the pursuit of beauty. That night, as the lanterns in Gion flickered out one by one, Satoko removed her makeup for the last time. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, the bare face of an old woman staring back at her. And for the first time in decades, she allowed herself to cry, not for sadness but for gratitude. She had lived her life as a geisha, and though the world around her had changed, she had remained true to her art. And that, she thought, was enough.